Hello, thank you very much. Okay, we are back for this next session. Jonathan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, and thank you, Belen, for moderating that really interesting session and great closing messages there. Act quickly, in coordination, no going back to oil, but still we have to pay for it somehow. And so Moaz Sharif, our lead energy specialist, normally based in Rabat, but now in Tunis under lockdown, like everybody else, will be leading our session. So Moaz, please take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Belen. Hello, everyone, and I hope you can hear me well. Excellent. So welcome to our next session on best practice in financing CSP projects. We have a very diverse panel to bring different points of view. We have Yoonhee Lu from Aqua, who will bring the developer perspective. We have Gabriel Delatour and Eric Becker from EBRD and IFC, respectively, to bring the international financial institution perspective. Then we have Ali Jafari, who will, from Standard Chartered, will bring the private investor, private lender perspective. And finally, Danny Morris from the CTF, who will bring the perspective of Green Climate Fund. Without further ado, let me ask Yoonhee Lu to start. Please keep your interventions short and to the point, and as much as possible, draw out the experience of financing CSP projects and what are the lessons learned that can be applied to new projects.
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. And this is Yoonhee Lu. I'm from Aqua Power. We are a Saudi company. I have been, Aqua Power, we have done almost, one of the many large projects, CSP projects in the world. Today, I will just give a very brief introduction on the CSP project we have financed. Some of them I was responsible for the financing. Some of them I was involved in the financing process with a larger team. I will just briefly introduce three countries or three projects because the CSP project actually the financing structure is very different from country to country depending on the structure put in place by relevant governments and also the financing conditions. Start from Morocco, the Mazen project. I started working on that Mazen program from 2011. From now on, and it's 160 megawatt parabolic trough CSP project. Then now two is 200 megawatt PT, and then 150 tower project. The financing of that project was very unique. It's a concessional financing from IFIs, I think, including IBRD, including AFD, and European Central Bank, and also CTF also part of that. And then they are lending to Mazen, and then Mazen is on lending to the project. Because of the concession financing nature, as a sponsor for us, we need to put in place a much stronger supporting system, including a very strong competition support structure during construction periods and up to 3 years post COD. And also because Mazen as off-taker lender and also shareholder, there's another structure for sponsors to basically make sure certain level of return is maintained and from, let's say, construction commissioning and also 3 years of operation. So this kind of structure has been put in place very successfully, and the financial close and development process have been managed very professionally. So I think one key challenge I want to raise is basically I think the whole due diligence process, we have to be it's very strict, because it's meant by Mazen, but behind Mazen is certain IFIs and very strict compliance and due diligence requirement. So the sponsors and each stakeholder, including EPC contractor, O&M operator, need to make sure and comply. So that's I think this is a very big bunk of work we have been doing. The second example I want to explain is the South African CSP market. Is a completely different market. Two projects we have been financed. One is called Bookport, is 50 megawatts CSP. Another one, Redstone, 100 megawatts CSP. And then South African market is a completely different market. It's because it's mainly the PPA is in local currency, and the sponsors will have to rely on local liquidity, mainly from local banks like ABSA, like DBSA, Investec, plus certain international financial institutions and multilaterals, and to basically finance the project. Unlike Morocco, basically the whole structure is a little bit, let's say, concessional nature. In South Africa, of course, the DSCR level is much higher because it's purely commercial risk. Of course, the tenure is also much shorter, and it's actually less than 20 years. So the key challenge you have been facing in South Africa is basically, unlike other countries, is very changing. The market of the FX market, because our as a sponsor, we are structuring our EPC. The intentional EPC is always in dollar, but our financing resources in local currency. The volatility of the local currency, the FX risk is always every day. Every week we need to revise the financing need, financial requirement. We need to keep in continuous discussion with the banks, and this raises lots of challenges for us to actually close the financing on time and manage a large group of lenders. Third example I want to raise, and it's a very famous project. I'm sure my partner Standard Chartered from Ali, who was Standard Chartered was leading structuring bank for the biggest CSP project called DAY1, the 950 megawatts, including 700 megawatts CSP and 200 megawatts PV. The 700 megawatts CSP is including 600 megawatts parabolic trough and 100 megawatt tower. We closed that project recently, and it's already in construction for 1 year. That structure again is very different. It's dollar financing. It's $4.4 billion project. As a sponsor, the biggest challenge we're facing is liquidity, because nowhere else in the world we have financed such big scale CSP. And if you only rely on, let's say, local market, we don't have the liquidity. Unfortunately, we were working with Standard Chartered, helping us. We were working with Chinese banks, we were working with local banks, and we put together, we aligned the structure, aligned the interests of everyone. So I think we successfully raised $3 billion. Then I think if I want to highlight the challenge we're having, is basically it's the unique experience for us to understand, the unique working nature of Chinese banks, for them to learn, let's say, for them from leading bank like very international bank like Standard Chartered, in the structuring and how to follow the diligence process, and also to coordinate between, let's say, local banks and international banks, Chinese banks, how to manage smoothly the whole diligence process and the approval process. I think that's, as a from the sponsor side, it's something very unique experience, and it's very challenging work, and also taking lots of time for us to close the project. I think this applies. I want to share the experience because this applies actually if you want to a very large scale. The CSP is very capex incentive. it will require there is a global collaboration. It cannot be done just with a certain limited resource of the liquidity. I'm going to stop there because I think I want to leave the floor to others, and then I'm ready to answer any questions they may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yunhei. Can we please have Gabriel Delatour from EBRD?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just upload my presentation. EBRD, we have not financed yet any CSP project. However, we are very advanced in supporting the latest Noor project, CSP project in Morocco. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a bit our perspective on what we think would be required for a non-recourse financing of a CSP project, and what are a bit the specificities of the CSPs, and then maybe give you a bit of a overview, a very quick one of Noor Delta. I know that earlier today Tariq from Mazen presented some details on the project, so I won't go into details, but the idea is really to give you the perspective of a lender. So I think there are three big considerations that are important for us as lenders in structuring a project finance for CSP, which is a bit particular to CSP. First of all, the first one is that the price of CSP is still high, and this has been already discussed earlier today. The chart that you see here is a bit old, so it's a bit outdated. We did hear earlier in the previous panel that there was some expectation that the tariff could go as low as below $6 cents. But we also heard, and including from Yunhei earlier, that in countries like South Africa or in China, that the CSP projects are developed on the assumption that of subsidized power, and not and so this is a concern for us, because as the lenders we always tend to look at what is the tariff, what is the break-even tariff of the project? Can it sustain a crisis, a drop in consumption? And I think the COVID crisis today is a very good example of what can happen to these projects if they're too expensive. The second dimension that we look at as a lender is the complexity of the technology. For very straightforward projects like solar PV or wind, we do have suppliers now who provide warranties. We also can limit the number of variables in terms of the generation yield. With CSP, of course, things are a bit more complex. In the chart I show here, a chart which comes from the Noor plant, which is illustrative to show you the complexity of how a plant can run, and how difficult it is to make sure that all the assumptions are very solid for a banker's financial model. The projects are longer to build. Mr. Lee from Subcon earlier said 18 months was a record, but I think for these very large scale ones, it's longer. There are fewer projects than PV developed, so the track record is not as high, and of course the ENS dimensions are also important. So the technical challenges are higher than for other projects. The third dimension, I think, which makes CSP more complex for us lenders to structure as project finance, is the fact that CSP combines generation and storage. Whereas the storage is customarily used for load shedding, load shifting, producing solar during the night, as one described it earlier. Of course, it can also be used for other users, other ancillary services. So it's very difficult for a bank to predict, to model accurately the usage of CSP. And this is one of the challenges we see for CSP, but also for storage, for battery storage, etc. in general. Another point is that few countries have actually developed a specific regulatory regime for CSP. And so usually CSP projects are subject to the same rules as other IPP projects, other storage. So they're in direct competition. And also, this is a second consideration. Finally, as you can see in these tables, we can see different types of ways the tariff is structured. If you look at the Moroccan example, and which is very much adapted to the load shifting function of the CSP plant, you have a tariff, and then you have a premium for all the power produced after sunset. This is something we see also in other type of storages, but you also have other methods. You have tariff with capacity payments. In some countries, such as Spain or China, we've also seen just a feed-in tariff. And then, of course, that's more a theory than in practice. You could envisage in a liberalized market some form of trading with CSP. So this is another a consideration that comes to play as a lender in our assessment of the risks for CSP, which maybe are a bit come as add-ons to what we would usually do for PV or wind. The second part of my discussion for me today is to present very briefly the Nurmided project. I'm not the best person to present it. I'm not an engineer nor the sponsor, but I thought it would be interesting to show you a few how we can see the project. So on this slide, you can see the main features. It's a very large project. And I think and it's a very innovative project in that it combines solar PV and CSP. That means the technology is complex. It includes a concept of producing of using actually the PV panels to export power to the grid during the day, but also to heat the molten salt. And there's also batteries which are stored, which are powered by the PV panels during the day, and come to operate the plant after a sunset. So for us, this was a very interesting structure, and I have to praise the dynamism and of Mazen, the Moroccan agency for sustainable energy, as it's now known, for their ambition in developing CSP, because it's quite remarkable. Finally, I just want to come down to the structure, because as I mentioned, we, EBRD, have not seen a pure non-recourse or have not had an opportunity directly to finance pure non-recourse financing. In this project, we are actually financing the equity bridge financing for one of the sponsors. However, of course, in the Noor projects, as we know, Mazen has been very proactive in structuring the non-recourse financing on their books and taking significant financing including from institutions from our colleagues on this panel today to finance the projects. We should have probably added the names of all of you on the chart, but I think what I wanted to show in this last chart is that Mazen has found the right financing structure to make these projects work. The question remains if you can finance on a pure non-recourse financing these projects. I understand that our colleagues at Aqua have achieved this in South Africa. I would be also very interested to hear more about this maybe in the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this very interesting perspective. So now we will hand over to Eric Becker for another perspective from a multilateral IFI. Eric?
Yes. Hi, Moise. I don't know, are we going to put up the presentation? I think Araceli or so has it supposed to put it up.
Okay, so you're not sharing your screen, right?
Because it doesn't work. Otherwise, I would totally do it. I'm not trying to be difficult.
Let's see.
I had discussed with the organizers.
Maybe
they have the
colleagues at ATA a few minutes to put it up. But if can you start speaking?
I mean, I can start. I can start,
yeah.
Of course. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. So it's very interesting to listen in also into the earlier presentations and the earlier panel. I have to say it's a tough one to follow because we obviously heard a lot of positive news and a lot of breakthrough news from the previous panel, but I have to say our viewpoint is a little different, and that has to do with the fact that we were very much an early mover with this technology and in this space. So the lessons I will sort of share with the rest of the audience today is really our lessons that were derived from a total of 4 investments that we made in Middle East and Africa. So next slide. So we can go to the next slide. So between 2012 and 2016, no, before, so previous slide. Sorry, this one, yes. So we've committed 212 million to finance a total of 400 megawatts of CSP, which was largely parabolic trough-free projects and 1 tower project. These were at the time some of the largest CSPs anywhere in the world, certainly the first CSPs we financed, first CSPs in Africa, and one of them was actually the largest project financing in South African history. So we can go to the next slide. So these were very much early generation projects. At the time, we were motivated by a number of factors. One, we wanted to see the technology mature. We wanted to help to make it achieve a breakthrough. We also deemed that it was able to store more energy than really any other renewable energy could do. And probably if we do that analysis today, we would still stand by it. I think it is just intrinsically good at being able to replace thermal generation. This is the thing that we found attractive about it, rather than supporting only solar PV, which in most cases is a complement to an existing thermal dominated power system. But here we're really talking about technology that can replace thermal power stations altogether. At the time, we looked at parabolic troughs as a technology that we thought was very, very manageable, and we also invested in the tower project, which seemed very promising. I would say, based on what we know now, or our own personal experience, we're a little less convinced of the power tower concept, and at the same time, probably more comfortable with the parabolic troughs. So Gabriel mentioned before that one of the considerations were the tariffs. Absolutely, I agree. This was a consideration for us too. Our early projects had tariffs of up to 35 cents. And I mean, now we know we're far below 10 cents. So obviously we've seen a steep decline. So this is a technology in flux, which was part of the thesis that we had, but it's also part of the problem, because you can appreciate that when you finance a project that is at the earlier stage of this price drop, that creates a lack of incentives or lack of alignment with the off-taker after a while. So maybe let's go to the next slide. So what happened to the project? So one of them, the Tower project, actually became the IJ Deal of the Year 2013. It also won a couple of other awards. In terms of construction itself, it's a mixed bag. Some completed almost on time. One was delayed by almost 1.5 years. One thing that surprised us that there were a lot more operational issues during the ramp up than we had expected. We had a lower than expected plant availability, substantially below targets. We had a number of fires, we had deteriorating underperformed mirrors, we had corrosion problems with heat exchangers, we had all kinds of technical issues that basically led to an underperformance. Interestingly, because there weren't that many projects, often the EPC contractors were also struggling to identify the best ways to actually overcome these problems, because they had never encountered them themselves. So today, all of the projects are working, some better than others. One or two still substantially below the initial expectations, and the tariffs at 18 to 35 cents are clearly higher than what you would see with other technologies these days. So next slide. So if you ask me what distinguishes the CSP model or projects from traditional renewable energy projects, so one is these are very expensive projects and these are complex projects. As a result, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it means is you have a much smaller pool of potential investors. Because you need investors that have a certain level of sophistication and a certain balance sheet size. This is different from CSP, sorry, from PV, where you have a much larger universe of potential investors who may show up if you start tendering. You have a longer construction and ramp up period, which overall increases the financing costs, because it's just a more complex and costlier financing compared to some of the easy renewable projects. The higher technology risk also results in less predictable cash flows, and basically what that means is that as a bank, we would like to see sponsors committed to stay involved in the long run in these types of projects, because they're so complex and they require a lot of know-how. We would be much more would request much more from the investors than we would do on a, let's say, normal PV project or a wind project, which are much simpler. It was mentioned before also by Gabriel, the CSP economics are more complicated, because basically you have generation and storage, which often is also awarded in different tariffs, which also makes the financial model more complicated, because you also have to predict not only the overall production, but you also have to predict exactly when you're producing and in which category of tariff you're falling. So this is just making overall predictability lower and harder to explain. Next slide. So this is my last slide. So what are our lessons, our IFC lessons? Is so I think it's very important to have good and strong sponsors, and I think we were lucky enough to have sponsors such as Aqua or Mazen, who are some of the industry leaders in this space. And yet, we also had other sponsors, and basically what we realized is when you see sponsors or project participants play multiple roles in a project, you have conflicts of interest, potential and actual, and this should not be underestimated. So this is just something that we realized as we were doing these projects. Second lesson is when you invest in new technology, and in 2012-13, this was a new technology, relatively speaking, you should prepare for the worst. We thought we had very conservative financing structures, and it basically wasn't enough. So our typical project financing assumptions did not get us to where we needed to be. So CSP, by and large, at least based on our experience, would have to be financed in a more conservative way than simpler technologies that we're seeing these days. Structuring matters. We had deployed in a number of these projects mezzanine financing because we thought it would be an interesting way to buffer the resource risk and overall de-risk the project. But we ended up basically absorbing most of the technology risk, which basically wasn't a very good idea. So we wouldn't probably do it again. And the last is the economics matter. So even if you have a good rationale why 35 or 30 or 20 cent is a realistic price, and all project parties are fairly remunerated and not more than that. If the projects are a lot more expensive than the average cost of production, they will have problems. They will face problems. They will face questions down the road. This is something that we've also learned the hard way, and I think EBRD mentioned it before. Gabriel, I think is very true. So this is from my side. The summary again. I'm very heartened by what I heard in the previous panel. It looks like a lot of the problems that we may have encountered as one of the early movers may have been overcome, and that perhaps the future is brighter than some of the immediate past. So very happy to hear that, and looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this very interesting perspective on early CSP projects. So now we will have Ali Jafari from Standard Chartered, from a private sector perspective, please.
Thanks a lot for having me over to speak on this conference and give a private sector perspective on CSP projects. I mean, it's a bit of a hard task following two lenders, giving more sort of information on how to finance a CSP project. But you know what I'll try to do is I'll try to not repeat what Eric and Gabriel said as much as possible. But I would rather speak about the specific project that we financed last year, well, actually a couple of years back, and I think Yunhei touched upon that. It was the DAY1 CSP project, which I believe is the largest CSP project in the world, and was in fact the first CSP project the Standard Chartered Bank financed as a lead bank, as a documentation bank, as a structuring bank, and we put quite a sizable financing in the project as well. Now, the DAY1 CSP project itself was basically originally supposed to be a 200 megawatt project, and our original intention was to go into the project with a smallish sort of a ticket and learn the CSP sector along the way. I mean, you know that there has been a lot of PV projects financed in the region. Actually pretty much standardized financing structures. A lot of banks, all international, local banks are keen to finance these projects. But this was the first CSP project. Well, actually the second, but the first utility scale CSP project in the region, Middle East region, that was being developed. And the first one certainly for us to look at. Excuse me. So we had to learn quite a bit during the process, and we were acting as the lead bank in the project as well. So it was not only for us, but for the lenders that we had to support. So you know, the first thing that we look at while financing a project is whether the project is required in a particular country. I think that's the key aspect of any excuse me, risk allocation. That you know, we as a commercial bank, we usually do not finance a project if it's like a bridge to nowhere. So that project has to be justified in a particular jurisdiction. And when we looked at the CSP project originally, we thought that, you know, it will have its usual 15, 16 cents tariff. And in the heart of Middle East, you know, why would you pay such a high tariff for a project, for a power project where you can basically have a gas-fired power project or a PV project with a much, much lower tariff? Now, when we delved deep into it, we realized that this is something which actually did make sense. First of all, the project was based in Dubai. Dubai, unlike the popular belief, Dubai itself doesn't have any hydrocarbons, and it has a strategy of diversifying its power generation sources. And this project was quite a critical part of that, because this is the only renewable project which is obviously going to use indigenous resource of sunlight and is going to dispatch power 24 hours a day. From that perspective, the country actually did need diversification. Obviously, at that time, at the time of putting in the bid along with Aqua Power, we didn't realize that the tariff is going to be so competitive, but we were assured by the sponsors that the tariff is not going to be 16, 17 cents. It is going to be around a level which will be sustainable for the country or the emirate. And when the tariff was announced, 7.3 cents, it was obviously a surprise to us at that point in time, because it definitely fit the bill as far as the sustainability of the tariff is concerned. But the other thing, which actually was a bit of a challenge, was that Aqua had put in a bid for an alternative bid for a much larger project. So that effectively meant not only upscaling the size of the project, but also bringing in other technologies as well. So originally it was supposed to be one technology, but the project ended up being 3 different technologies wrapped into one project. It has 250 megawatts of PV capacity, 600 megawatts of parabolic trough, and 100 megawatts of tower. Now, effectively, all 3 technologies are being provided by 3 different entities. As a lender, we, as you know, I mean, this is limited recourse project financing. 101 is that you need to have a single point lump sum turnkey contract. Now, these technologies being provided by 3 different technology providers did pose a problem. So to overcome that, we had to reach out to, or the sponsors had to reach out to Shanghai Electric, which itself didn't have a lot of CSP experience, but what it did was it has the credit rating and the balance sheet, and it gave a wrap to the other technology providers, which were BrightSource, Abengoa, and the PV panel providers. And it was presented as a single point EPC contract to the lenders, so that, you know, if there is, I mean, the project is still under construction, so if there is any issue with the construction, we can obviously go after Shanghai Electric. So that is critical from a lender's perspective. Now, on top of that, we had several structuring elements within the power purchase agreement, whereby different capacities of different technologies, the project is being built in 2 different phases. So we can effectively terminate portions of the project and get paid out if that portion is not going well. Now, technology risk, as Eric mentioned, is critical from any lender's perspective. I mean, obviously, this is we started looking at the project in 2018, not 2012. So there has been some track record of CSP capacity by that time, but still, it is not PV or a CCGT project where we have a lot of experience, especially on the tower side. So what we did was we had to engage the LTA very, very early, or the lender's technical consultant very, very early in the process, especially since a fairly large quantum of debt was required. This was a $4.3 billion project, so we had to raise $2.7 billion in debt. So we engaged the right technical advisor right in the start, and there's several, because most of the funding was coming from China or Chinese banks. several trips were made by the lender's technical advisor to China. A number of presentations were made. And then to overcome technology risk, we also built in the structuring in our facilities, whereby our coverage ratios in the initial periods are higher. Our debt service reserves are higher in the initial years till the time the project achieves operational stability. So we have several structuring elements within the financing structure, which allows us some additional comfort in the initial few years. And once the project achieves operational stability, once full synchronization is achieved, only then the coverage ratios, there is a step down in coverage ratios and a step down in the debt service reserve account. So there are a number of structuring elements that we built into the financing structure, which made it bankable. The other thing, which is quite a bit of challenge for I guess all CSP projects, is that to bring down the tariff, you obviously need to push the tenor out for the facilities. Now, we had to achieve 7.3 cents. We had to have a financing with 27-year tenor in place. Because, as you know, CSP projects or any renewable projects is all capital costs. The further you basically delay the repayment of the loans, the lower the tariff is going to be. So we had to, the ideal tenor that we ended up was 27 years. But this is usual now for PV projects, but for CSP project, it was quite a long tenor. So we structured it as a soft mini-perm structure, whereby after a certain years after COD or completion date, if the debt is not refinanced, then there will be 100% cash sweep, which will basically take away all the dividends from the sponsors, which places, and then there will be an increase in the pricing as well. So effectively, what we're trying to achieve there is that we're trying to ensure that the sponsors, within a few years of completion, the sponsors go out to the market again and try and refinance the project, which effectively allows us to look at it as a relatively shorter dated deal, rather than, even though the contractual tenor is 27 years, all the lenders actually are looking at it as a slightly shorter dated tenor.
Ali,
and the last,
excuse me, could you wrap up, please, because we are running out of time.
Yes.
I'm sorry about that.
Yes. So no, that's fine. So the last challenge, and I think one of the key challenges that we faced, and which I haven't faced with the other technology so far, is with the intellectual property rights. And the issue is that we as lenders, we need to have a security over everything, and the intellectual property owners in this case were Bright Source for the tower technology and Eben Goa for the parabolic trough technology. And the intellectual property is extremely important for heliostats and for parabolic trough, and we needed to have security over that. Whereas the technology providers, obviously, for them, IP rights are critical. And that's why they were very reluctant in giving away the IP rights and putting in security to the lenders, whereby the lenders can freely use them. So we had to structure an escrow arrangement whereby all the intellectual property was placed into an escrow with a third party, and only very, very limited use for the lenders. Only the use which is absolutely required is possible, and that is something that we negotiated with them. So there are a number of structuring things that we had to overcome. That's why the project took around 2 years to close, but eventually we were able to achieve financial close last year. So it was, I think, for us, it was a landmark project. And I guess this kind of wraps up my my speech.
Thank you very much, Ali. This very practical perspective from you. So last but not least, we have Danny Morris from the CTF.
Thank you, Moaz, and good morning, everybody.
Short, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be short and quick. I just want to say thanks to my other panelists. I think this is a really cool event because it's giving all of you an opportunity to kind of look under the hood of financing with some of these CSP projects and really see it step by step. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience from the climate investment funds, specifically the Clean Technology Fund. We actually are a sponsor of the event today, so we're glad that you all could be here. For those who don't know, let me just give you a brief intro on what the climate investment funds are. We are an $8 billion fund focused on driving climate action through 300 programs in 72 developing countries. We were set up in 2008 as really a driver of learning opportunities for IFIs and other entities to figure out how to do clean energy financing and other financing. So our business model is such that we work with 6 MDBs, that would be the World Bank, IFC, and the regional banks, to, in a programmatic way, to develop projects and programs in different countries. By programmatic, that means that we work with the MDBs and the countries themselves to develop a program of operations over time to really help bring clean energy that might be commercially available but not yet commercially viable into operation at a wide scale, and hopefully that leads to transformational impact in country. We do that by providing large amounts of what we call risk-bearing, patient, and below market rate finance, concessional finance, essentially, to support projects. The results that we've seen over the past couple of years kind of speak for themselves to the success of this approach. Just very quickly, the Clean Technology Fund is responsible for 26,500 gigawatts in clean power installed. And a complementary fund that focuses on energy access in low-income countries is responsible for 8.5 million people receiving improved access to energy. So with CTF, which has done a lot of work on CSP, it's the largest sum fund of the SIFs with 5.4 billion in financing. And one of the first interventions that we undertook with the CTF was in Morocco, which is also one of our most prominent successes. So since 2010, Morocco has received about 6 million in financing from us, concessional money, that has helped attract more than 5 billion in co-financing from MDBs and other development partners. And you've heard from some of those. You heard from Yunhei and Gabrielle earlier, who both have benefited from CTF concessional financing. Of the number I just stated, the 600 million, more than 2/3 of that has gone to solar thermal CSP in Morocco. And that commitment has been instrumental in the sector's growth. The NOR complex and NOR phases 1, 2, and 3 all received CTF financing. And I believe that Midelt has some financing as well. So the reason that that's important to point out is that the concessionality of these funds can really help establish technologies like CSP in a way that they haven't been established before. They allow countries like Morocco to take a chance on relatively new technologies that require a large upfront financial commitment, and also can support the scale needed to attract other investors. So with CSP in particular in Morocco, CSP was not proven by any means in the country. And in fact, when the financing was first allocated, there wasn't a large-scale CSP project anywhere in Africa. So what the financing from CTF was able to do, it was first able to attract the commitment and cooperation of other IFIs, and it sort of lent credibility to a technology that up to that point didn't have it. It also was sort of a big enough capital infusion to really support the scale that was needed for CSP in the country. Another thing it did is that it allowed Masen, who has been praised widely throughout this panel, to sort of not worry about those startup risks and focus on other risks like foreign exchange risk, that allowed it to bring in some other implementing bodies and other investors who wanted to come in with different currency. And so they could focus on that risk, knowing that the very concessional funding coming from CTF was able to sort of bear those other primary risks. We actually commissioned the Bloomberg New Energy Finance to do a study on sort of our experience with CSP in Morocco. And according to that study, there were some who said that the concessionality that came from CTF was able to reduce the bid price for NOR1 by 20 to 30%. So while we, we'll continue to watch and see how CSP costs overall continue to decline and develop, I think it's pretty clear that concessional interventions from CTF were transformational, at least in country, and will hopefully continue to maintain that momentum. Now, we can compare that with other investments that we made in renewables in the country. And while we consider those successful, they certainly weren't as transformational. And in particular, I'm talking about wind in Morocco. So the investment from CTF was a smaller scale. I think it was about 125 million. And part of that was because of the programmatic approach. And here I'll come back to Mazen and Morocco overall and saying that they really drove this. They recognized that CSP was a unique opportunity for them, and they drove that kind of investment. So a lot went there. There was, to a lesser extent, those concessional resources were given to the wind sector. Part of the reason why it was a lower investment is because wind at the time when CTF came in back in 2010 was much closer to commercial viability, and was already attracting some private sector investment. So the CTF concessionality wasn't as critical for the success of projects. But with that said, the investment was still successful, and CTF funds have helped bring enough investment in the wind sector in Morocco for it to meet its 2020 capacity goals. But again, I think the key lesson is that the country recognized the opportunity that CSP provided, and it pushed hard to make that happen, pushed the MDBs to deploy the resources effectively and work closely with them. So that's sort of the past. I think I just very quickly before we end want to talk about the future for CTF operations and the energy sector overall. When we look at clean energy technology and investment, I think we can learn the lesson. We can continue to get lessons from the CSP experience in Morocco because those investments included storage components. NOR included molten salt, and even the wind projects included pump hydro. And so, from our perspective, storage solutions are absolutely critical to increasing penetration of renewables across the globe and key to the continued transition away from fossil fuels. In response to the needs and the high needs that are out there for battery storage and other types of storage, we at CTF are launching a new program called the Global Energy Storage Program, which has been capitalized with $250 million contribution from the United Kingdom. For the record, all our donors are sovereign countries who want to see climate action in one way or another. So what we'll do with this new program is we'll utilize our MDB-driven business model to try and drive investment into various different storage technologies. That's not limited to batteries. That includes other technologies like flywheels, molten salts, green hydrogen, to the extent that we can get those projects in our pipeline, but it will also include policy interventions, technical assistance, and knowledge coordination, sort of all the pieces that need to come together and lay the initial groundwork so that other financial entities, whether they be IFIs or commercial banks, can come in and really do the heavy lifting. Taking the next leap to low carbon economies with sort of flexible, dispatchable, renewable energy will require the same kind of interventions that we saw with our experience in Morocco. That means MDB partners working closely with countries pushing the MDBs, asking them to push the envelope on new technologies and really find ways to utilize the risk-bearing finance that we at the Climate Investment Funds can provide. So, I think our experience shows that this approach can succeed with time, with ambition, clear thinking, and really appreciating the ways that concessional finance can drive change. So with that, again, thanks for the opportunity, and glad you all are here to learn from us, and hopefully we can get some good questions in before the end.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you all. Jonathan, do we have any time for discussion?
Yes, we have a few minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. So the key one of the key messages that I'm getting is because of the technological complexity of CSP, as well as the more complex economics of storage, financing from particularly from private type of lenders, from non-recourse and non-sovereign lenders, tends to be conservative. So how do we balance that with the need to lower the tariffs of CSP so that they can be competitive with thermal alternatives? And maybe also the question raised by Yunhei about liquidity. So how do we square that circle? Is the PPP approach that Morocco has been following, of kind of mixing public and private sector funds, part of the solution? How do we maximize concessional funds from the climate financing? So I think, given the short time that we have, I propose to give every speaker maybe 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes to intervene in the same order that they spoke. Yunhei, are you still there?
So thank you everyone, and I think it's very enlightening to hear the speech of the panelists. Very quickly, I think from sponsor perspective, because I have been working on CSP for already 9 years. Of course, including other price will continue to go down, regardless whether you need, let's say, the concessional financing. Of course, I think concessional financing is a very critical element to help certain governments, help certain policymakers to promote and encourage them to, let's say, to develop their technology. But I think in long term, we see clearly the drop down the price in the capex. We see clearly the efficiency improvement in different kind of let's say storage solutions, from storage solutions and the different let's say, whether it's public, trough, and tower, and even molten salt industry actually is with the more large scale projects is coming to the market. I think we see the drop down of the price, the whole supply chain. Plus, in terms of operation, we have our own operation and maintenance company. Since 2011 until, let's say, now last year, I have seen significant optimization in the operation and maintenance solution and price. Plus, I think different kind of structuring solutions, financing structuring solutions, and you see, as Ali has rightly said, the tenor, stretching the tenor, and with the proper structuring like soft min prom, and optimizing the, let's say, a certain DSCR and DSRA structure, and all these things putting together, I see actually lots of elements actually is driving the tariff to go down. You know, when 2011 I bid for No 1, 2012 I was like 16-17 cents. Today is already between 7-8 cents. I see it's going to be in the direction of, let's say, 5-6 cents for sure, and it will continue to go down. So I have no doubt about it. Yeah, please. I think I will be happy to listen to from others their opinion.
Thank you. Yeah.
I would just add that with the increased number of projects, CSP projects throughout the world, the growing size of these projects, we can see these very large projects in Morocco, South Africa developing. The price, and also with some incremental technological innovations such as adding more PV and batteries to the plants, the hope is that the price will continue to drop. With more projects coming on board, more experience in financing them, that should hopefully reduce also the funding costs, because they would de-risk these projects, so that hopefully these projects should not need in the future, in the mid to long-term future, any concessional money, which will make them much more resilient to you know, any changes during the long life of the PPAs.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'm not sure if I believe that Eric.
Yes,
Eric, you're still here. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
No, thanks. So very briefly, so from my side is I think the Moroccan model worked really well to sort of crowd in the lowest cost of funding by making available all this donor funding. I think it is a finite resource though, and I don't think it's an entirely scalable approach, and I don't think anyone can do what Morocco done, and I think even Morocco won't be able to do this forever. So I think at some point Morocco will have to open this up for a more commercial type of financing. If we're looking at a more commercial type of financing, we'll need to see how certain risks can be taken. So perhaps instead of using CTF as a source to bring down the pricing of a transaction, maybe it would be better to use them as a source of risk taking. So I mentioned earlier we had provided mezzanine financing, which ultimately ended up protecting the senior debt quite well. But took a lot of risks that in other cases equity would take. Now we're talking about how the technology has de-risked. So perhaps this would be a product that, if provided by sort of a non-commercially minded institution such as CTF, could really help to crowd in commercial funding while keeping the risk profile in check. And providing even, you know, like a bridge to the future where maybe that even isn't needed. So I can still see a role for CTF to play, and I can still see a need for certain risk mitigation that would have to be done in order to avoid, or in order to bring in commercial funding.
Thanks, Eric. I guess it's Ali's turn.
Yeah. So look, I mean, from our perspective, I mean, it's not something that I would generalize, in the sense that, look, in investment grade jurisdictions, top sovereigns, there will always be liquidity from commercial banks available. I think technology risk is something that the lenders can overcome, commercial lenders can overcome, either through enhanced due diligence or through certain structuring elements, as I explained, into the financing structure, or through other levels, types of support. But the key things that the lenders require are long-term, I mean, in these sort of things, to provide long-term, very, very long-term debt, they would require bankable contractual structure with the sovereigns or sub-sovereigns in these high investment grade countries. Now, when you move to these investment grade countries, they can raise larger amounts of debt as well, so they can get the scale in their projects as well, like Dubai did, which would automatically bring down the pricing. Now, if you move on to the smaller countries, or not small countries, but countries that do not have, that are not graded investment grade, like for example, we talk about Pakistan or Jordan, then, you know, we would require commercial, long-term commercial financing will always be a challenge, and we would require, for these projects, we would require institutions like IFC or export credit agencies to come in and do some risk, either risk mitigation for the commercial lenders, or provide direct funding, because there will always be challenge to raise long-term liquidity for these projects. And as I said before, I mean, there is just you just need to stretch the tenor to effectively to reduce the tariff, and it completely depends on one country to the other and one jurisdiction to the other as to where we are willing to lend.
Thank you, Ali. Danny, the last word is to you.
Yeah, thank you, Moaz. Let me start off by just echoing a lot of what Eric said. I totally agree, and I think he has the he has the right perspective. You all can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah. So I think that's right. I think, you know, it's important to recognize that every technology is going to be a little different, and in country it might be a little different. And so Morocco was able to do this in a way that other countries wouldn't. They recognized that opportunity and they kind of took it and they ran with it. And one of the things that they were able to do and do well was sort of take advantage of the concessional funds that were available to them. Now, this started back in 2010 when we knew a lot less about how to do these kind of operations. Now, as we move forward, I think we in the climate investment funds recognize the role that we can play, and it's one that that Eric pointed out, which is sort of use this as risk-bearing capital in one way or another, right? And that includes using it as, you know, we have our resources are grants. They often go out as grants or very, very concessional loans, but we can also do mezzanine financing. We can do equity investments. We have a whole range of financial tools that can really carry the heaviest burden of risk when it's needed to move things forward. But in order to do that, we kind of need to be pushed. And I think our partners need to be pushed a little bit as well. So I just want to address one of the questions that was raised, which is how good are the MDBs at supporting technology that aren't quite commercially viable, but nonetheless have great promise? I think they're very good when they are asked to do that. And, you know, MDBs they're, you know, big, powerful bureaucracies. And I don't mean that term as a pejorative. I just mean it as the reality of what they are. And they can sort of be fundamentally conservative because at the end of the day, they want to serve their clients and they want to make sure that they have successful projects. So if clients, in this case, countries, are showing up and saying, we want to take this risk, we want to work with this technology that maybe isn't totally commercially viable, but we think it has great promise, then the MDBs can be motivated to do that. And when they do that, then they can work with us, and it's easier for them to work for us in that situation. We in the climate investment funds, you know, we're $8 billion. We are a powerful entity when engaged, but we're sort of a small drop in the bucket. And so it helps when people sort of recognize what we can do and come to us looking for those solutions and looking for those opportunities. So, you know, Moaz, to answer one of your questions, I think the public-private mix of financing has a lot of potential moving forward as we get more into energy storage and grid integration. I think it's a really powerful tool, and I hope it's one that we will continue to take advantage of as we push forward for transformational change.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you all very much. I think we're out of time, but this was a very rich discussion. So thank you so much. And let's, the journey is will move forward, and let's these type of technologies are more needed than ever. Albeit, I mean, it may not be pure CSP as such, and as we have said, we are moving towards more of a mix of technologies, CSP with PV, with batteries and different forms of storage. But I think the same concepts that we have discussed will apply to those dispatchable renewable energy technologies. Thank you.